Today I'm breaking down 5 signature sounds inside Golden, the techniques that make it hit so hard in the K-pop world and beyond. From tight drums to wide pads and that glossy pop sheen, these are just some of the ingredients that really make this track shine. I'll show you how to build them into your own productions, and more importantly, why they work, so you can adapt the same tricks into your own tracks. So let's dive in, but first, here's the example. Okay, so I want to jump right in with the first sound that I think really makes this chorus, and that is this pluck bass right here. So a lot of these sounds do tend to come with a lot of sub-frequencies out of the box, but what I typically like to do is ensure that this sort of takes care of more of the top end of the bass, and I've still got some kind of sub underneath it just to really give it that bottom end. So as you can hear underneath, I've got the 808 and Reese. And so I've got this sound within Serum. It's from a pretty old pack, actually by Oliver, Power Tools number 2. Just a Serum preset, very basic pluck bass. And what I've done to really get it to mesh with that sort of lower sub bass without clashing, without getting, super muddy, I've actually gone to this little pencil icon here, then to process, and then remove fundamental. And doing that for both oscillators is a really good way just to kind of remove that fundamental information from the bass sound itself and just allow it to mesh with those lower basses. So this is what they sound like together. And of course, you may want to eliminate some of that clicking, which you can do usually just by adjusting the attack. Neglected to do it here, but definitely something to consider, especially if you're kind of hearing those sort of artifacts throughout your track. And as for some of the processing that I think is really worth mentioning, we've definitely got some sidechain happening here, as it is throughout the whole track on multiple instruments. It's got that old school sort of EDM pump to it, which I kind of really like. And here we're just using Kickstart 2. We've chained it to my kick, and it's just fading in and out every time that kick hits. And just as I play you the example, just have a look at how it's just outlining the waveform of the kick itself. This just ensures that we're not going too far and that we're not dipping the volume an excessive amount. Another thing that I've done just to really kind of give it that grit and help it mesh is use a bit of soft clipping. So I've added some soft clip saturation and just, really hitting those peaks with the clipping itself. So, in isolation, it's not quite as nice as when it's in the track, but remember the goal here is context, and we really want it to sit well within the mix itself. This is a very dense mix, and it's very, kind of processed, heavily processed, and it makes sense to kind of crush things here and there just to get them to sit that little bit better. So that brings us to our second signature sound, the snare. This is not how I would typically process a snare, although it's not exactly the same as the original. It's very different to the way I would kind of choose a snare for maybe a track like this, but I really enjoyed the challenge of trying to find the right sound for it. I really looked to the kind of EDM sample packs. Vengeance is a big one I think would suit this genre a lot. I actually have on hand, I think it's EDM 3, which is a great pack, and there are some really just good bread and butter sounds for this particular style. I think it works really well. So it sounds like this. So it's a little bit extreme in isolation again, and you can see on the actual waveform itself, we've got this really, really long waveform, and that's because there was some, I think, reverb built in to the initial sample, and I've sort of chopped it in half. It doesn't have the kind of low-end punch or that sort of around maybe 170 boost that I would typically choose for a snare. And the reason for that is the kick is really supporting it on every hit. So it's giving it its sort of low end foundation. On top of that snare, I've added this sound here. And this sort of thrashy sound has just given it that sort of higher mid crack that I think it needed. It was just feeling a touch bland without it. So although this isn't exactly the same snare setup as in the original, I feel that the way we've kind of positioned it and processed it might be a little bit similar. So if we have a look at the processing here, I've actually dipped a little bit around that sort of 150, which is where the fundamental of this particular snare is sitting. And the reason for that, again, is so we can allow that kick to punch through. So here's the snare in isolation with the kick. So right after that, we've got just a little bit of transient design on the drum bus plugin, just in parallel with a little bit of drive and crunch after it, and then just a touch of soft clipping. Now, what you'll notice is that this is the same processing as on my drum group, and it's sitting outside of my drum group. And the reason for that is that I got to a certain point of the track where the snare was just feeling super small, super crushed, and you might experience this in your own tracks as well. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to take it out of the drum group and process it separately. I personally find that that can alleviate a lot of issues. Same with your kick. If you feel that it's not sitting inside your drum group after you've processed it, maybe you've gone too far in one direction, pulling it out and just sort of starting fresh without kind of destroying the mix and having to start over can be a really good move. So individually on those snare layers, I've got a little bit of smack attack, bit of transient design just to really help that punch. When you listen to the record back, you can definitely hear those transients punching through the mix, both on the kick and the snare. So really important that you get that snap. And I've done more or less the same on the second layer, just so they both really cut through the mix. And again, both in parallel. I don't want to over-process. I don't want to destroy the original character that I went for in the first place. And one thing that I've done on the snare that is really important is add this gated reverb. So I've got a return track set up with H-verb on. We've got a decent tail on it, 4 seconds, and we've just dampened out some of that high end, and we've got it hooked up to our main snare. So if we have a look without that reverb, this is what it sounds like. And then with the reverb, it sounds like this. Again, not ideal in isolation, but along with the kick makes a little bit more sense. So basically this is giving us a very explosive reverb that the gate is then shutting down based on how you set it up in the gate itself. So you want to make sure that it is in time with the song as best you can at least, but focusing primarily on shaping the gate through the threshold, hold, and release is really what's going to get you the result here. So hooking it up through Ableton, just to your snare, and running it directly after a reverb to give you that explosive sound beneath the actual snare sample itself. So the third signature sound that we're going to look at are the atmospheric pads. So there are quite a few layers I've got here, but of course they're all doing different things and they're all in contrast to each other. So that's the most important thing when choosing pads and layering them, is that they each fill a certain part of the frequency spectrum. You don't want two really sort of upper mid pads playing at the same time, nor do you want two sort of mellow low end pads playing at the same time, because they end up clashing, your mix will end up muddy, and it just doesn't make any sense to do that. So I've implemented something I like to call frequency division. That concept alone just reminds me that I need contrast in order to get that width and in order to sort of create the depth that I want to create with pads. So if we have a look at the very first line, it's the violins at the top and we've got them panned to the right. So in isolation, a super basic line, but definitely playing its part in the mix and the arrangement, of course. Then next we have a choir pad. Now, the reason I put this in is because before I was thinking about using the vocal in this particular track, I heard in those backing vocals just some really nice sort of choir-like backup vocals, which I thought would be really cool to include either way. And so I've got this vocal pad that I've done in Exhale, and this is what it sounds like. And so what I've done is go into Exhale and really customize the voices on both engines. So I basically found a really nice pad sound, stripped it of some of those kind of effects and things like that. This is a really cool thing you can do with Exhale in general. Just taking away those effects, all of that sort of, tricky pan stuff and stuff that sounds really cool but can sometimes feel a little less practical in context. So I've basically just chosen the R vowel, something nice and breathy, something that doesn't require sort of a lot of tweaking, and just sort of let it sit with the chords. And it created a really, really nice texture. I added a little bit of reverb, some slight high pass filtering, and a touch of compression, just to really level it out a little bit. So a really cool layer that you can start implementing to just get that depth and contrast within your mixes. So next up, we've got a bit of a weird sort of pad sound, but sometimes things that are a little bit left of center or things that you wouldn't necessarily use in isolation can be great for layering because they're just unique enough to contrast the other sort of maybe more stock standard sounding pads. So here's this sound in isolation. So you can really hear the detune, and it's a little bit wobbly, which is kind of cool. Again, not something I would use by itself, but it's again just a preset that I had lying around from Cymatics. I didn't really touch it much. I think I may have turned the release down or something like that. But yeah, it just sat really nicely in the mix, I think, in contrast to the other elements that I had. And lastly, we've just got something that's a little more mellow, closer to something like, a Prophet synth or something like that. And nothing too complicated going on here. We've really just kind of copied that violin line on some of these pad sections just to really give it that depth and emphasize that harmonic movement. And not a whole lot of processing going on. We've just got a little bit of basic EQ. And something that I really like to do on pads is just add a little bit of soft clipping just to kind of give it some weight, some density, because a lot of these sort of floatier, mellow pads just tend to be a little bit kind of, I guess, transparent, which can be super nice sometimes, but sometimes I really want them to sit a little bit thicker in the mix. So something like Soft Clip does a great job of that. And so here are those pads in isolation with the sub bass. And lastly, for the processing of those pads, I should mention there is Kickstart 2, giving us a little bit of sidechain, again, just on that beat, sidechain to the kick. I think it's dipping slightly less on the pads than the basses, just to give it a little bit more breathing room. And, that was something I sort of picked up listening to the track. I was hearing the kind of underlying rhythmic pump of those pads, and I really, was trying to match it there. So slightly less of a dip there, but still with this kind of K-pop four-to-the-floor style, definitely important that you add some sidechain to your synths. So that brings us to our fourth signature sound, which is the kick. And this is what it sounds like in isolation. So if you've watched any of my other videos, definitely less of that kind of bottom end thump in the kicks here. And for this track in particular, we're really looking for a slightly thinner kick, something with a little less of that bottom end that can really support the snare and basses in a way that doesn't override them. So this is the first subsample that I picked. And then underneath that, we've got a top kick. And this has little to no bottom end in it. It just does a great job of creating that click at the very top. So if we go back to the sub, you can see that we've got a little bit of EQ. I took out some of those mids because the kick is so consistent and hitting, 4 on the floor at all times. You really want to make sure that that's pleasing to the ear. And if there's any kind of disruptive frequency, you're really going to notice it in a situation like this. So I took some of that out with some dynamic EQ, rolled off some of the top end just so we make way for our top kick, really given it a bit of a boost. Because we're a little bit of a higher kick here, I could afford to give it a bit of a boost around 74. And following that up with a bit of smack attack, again, we want to match the energy of that snare, making sure that it's snappy and hitting hard the whole way through. So in parallel, but we've gone a little more to the extreme here on the attack on the transient, and roll back just a little bit of the sustain so it remains kind of snappy, and so, the length doesn't kind of get in the way of the basses. As for processing on the top kick, again, just a bit of EQ, some standard clip just to get it to sit a little bit better. We're kind of rounding off those peaks with soft clipping, which can be really nice. As usual, we've got a layer of soft clipping, just really taming them both, making sure they're both sitting well together, and adding a little bit of soft clip saturation, just so you can see what it's doing here. So it's really rounding out a significant amount of those peaks, but again, it's working here because it has to sit consistently across the track, and this tames it really well. Then of course, we're using drum bus just in parallel, really emphasizing those transients one more time, and using the drive and crunch just to give it that extra bit of body. And lastly, we have technique number 5, which is ear candy and effects. So we're going to start actually with the effects. These can be really important in creating that impact on the entry to something like a chorus. So as you can hear, first up, we've got this cymbal. So it's got some sort of underlying effects to it as well, which is really cool. It's a cymbal and some sort of white noise underneath it. Then we've got this downlifter here. So those together create a pretty clean impact. This is what they sound like in context. And then, of course, we've got that reverse cymbal just leading up to that pause, which I think really helps drive it into that next section. So other than your sort of stock standard effects like risers and downlifters, we've also got some ear candy elements within the drums. And I think this is something a lot of producers tend to forget in the early stages, being so focused on more synths and things like that. But really creating ear candy elements within your drums can make your track so much more interesting. And here are some examples of how they've done it in this track. The very first one is this triplet snare fill. Maybe not the exact sound, but again, just wanting to take away the principle of this. And this really drives it to that next section alongside the effects really well. So in isolation, this is what it sounds like. So it's really just a loop that I picked up again from that Vengeance sample pack, just playing the triplets right up until that stop. I think there's even sort of a clap in the background of that. I'll show you in context now. This is what it sounds like. So something like a snare fill like that, super basic. It's not super present in the mix, but you can sort of feel it driving towards that next section, which can be really powerful in your mixes. Another element is this really verbed out snare. I didn't really go ahead and make the gated reverb for this because the sample sort of just did what it needed to do. And this is what it sounds like in isolation. And you know, that really explosive snare can have a really big impact on that final hit. So especially where it's happening here where there's a pause, it definitely plays a clear role here. So I'll show you just in context. Whether it's a sample like this or even a verbed out clap or percussion or something unique to you in your track, a little element like that under even every 8th snare can make a massive difference. And the last bit of ear candy on these drums is the very 80s tom fill. So this is what it sounds like in isolation. I've more or less chopped up an Oliver sample. It does something a little different, but I've matched it up to hit those triplets. Again, it's very subtle. It's not sitting too high in the mix. Toms often don't need to be as high in volume as most people think. They work just really nicely as a kind of underlying pulse. And again, driving us to that next section. So have a listen in context. This is what they sound like. Could probably go a little bit louder, but I think even with that, you can just kind of hear that underlying pulse and getting us to that next vocal section. So definitely try adding more ear candy elements like this within your drums. If you're an artist or producer and you want to stop relying on others and start releasing your music consistently while taking full control of your career, book a free growth call with me, link in the description. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.